I got a question, a real good question from a friend of Bunjie off deathbybunjie.com. There's a contact form on there. You can go in, fill out a little question, send me an email or something like that. And while you're there, sign up for the free Death by Bunjie email newsletter. You can unsubscribe at any time, but it's pretty cool stuff. So I think you should check it out. Really good question from Jacob Bailey, a friend of Bunjie, who says, can you give a dumbed down video on what exactly slugs are? Explaining kinetic energy would be good too. I get both a little bit, but you go into depth when you explain things, and when I try searching things, I get a crazy range of opinions and not much fact. I look to you, Sensei. I don't know about the sensei part, but when it comes to doing a dumbed down video about something, I'm your guy. If you go back to your high school science days, and that's really the only training that I have with science, so that's not really my bag, but I will tell you that there are basically three kinds of energy that apply when we talk about archery equipment, when we talk about crossbows. Really, there's just potential energy, kinetic energy, and momentum, right? That's about it. Potential energy is when you draw that string back. If you've got a crossbow, that's when you cock your crossbow and you put an arrow in there. That is potential energy. Those limbs are stressed back. That string is holding all of that potential energy, waiting to impart it on the arrow and send the arrow on its way. While it's being held back, that's potential energy. It has the potential to do something. It has the potential to do work by moving matter through space. And in this case, it's the arrow. No different than bowling, right? You take a bowling ball, when you're bowling, you swing that ball back up in the air, and when that ball's back in the air at its highest peak, when it's held right there, that's potential energy. The ball isn't doing anything, it's being held there, but it's got all the potential of being rolled down the lane. Maybe that's not the best example, but you get the point. Kinetic energy, now that's the energy that we really like, right? That's what's sending the arrow on its way. Kinetic energy is just energy in motion. That's the energy that gets the arrow to the target. It gets that arrow to the deer. That's pretty important, right? And when we look at crossbow manufacturers, that's the number measured in foot-pounds typically. That is, and foot-pounds is just a measurement, that's all it is. Don't get too worried about that. A certain arrow weight, a certain speed will generate a certain amount of kinetic energy, that energy in motion. How much energy does that arrow possess once the crossbow has done its job, once the crossbow has put all of its string energy, limb energy into that arrow, sends it on its way? That allows us to rate one crossbow and sort of measure it against another crossbow. It's a pretty good tool. If we go back to our bowling ball analogy, kinetic energy is basically once you release that bowling ball, it's rolling down the lane, it's heading toward the pins. It is expressing all of that kinetic energy. It's energy in motion. It's the bowling ball in motion, moving toward its target, the pins. How is kinetic energy expressed? Well, the scientists will tell you that it's 1/2 mass times velocity squared. Okay, that's just an equation that scientists use. It's basically you take 1/2 of the weight of the arrow and multiply that by the speed squared. Okay, that's what that is. Again, don't overthink this stuff. There are tons of online calculators. I talked about them all last year through Crossbow Appreciation Month when I was doing heavier arrows and looking at different speeds and playing with those sorts of things. It's fun stuff. You should play around with those different calculators if you haven't done so already. BestCrossbowSource.com or Realtree.com. Those are two that I go to all the time. My phone automatically knows what I'm looking for. It just, as soon as I start to type the word arrow, it brings up that as an option. Play around with those numbers and you'll see what I mean. Kinetic energy is also important because that's what's open in those mechanical broadheads. You need a certain amount of kinetic energy. Your bow or crossbow has to generate a certain amount of kinetic energy in order to force those blades open. Basically, all the crossbows made today generate enough kinetic energy to open mechanical broadhead blades. Now, while kinetic energy measures the amount of energy that the arrow has on the way to our target, on the way to the deer or other animal, well, how do we measure how much energy that arrow has once it gets there, right? And that's where momentum comes in. Momentum is basically how much energy, the quantity of energy that an arrow has when it reaches the target. How much energy is left to propel that arrow through the deer. That's measured in slugs. Now, I know that that sounds like a made-up term. When I first read that, I'm like, somebody's making this up. No scientist named it slugs, but apparently they did. It sounds like a made-up term. But nonetheless, slugs is just a measurement. It's just a unit of measure to sort of rate one amount of momentum versus another amount of momentum. If you want to get real technical, a slug, the definition of it is the mass that is accelerated by 1 foot per second squared when a force of 1 pound, 1 foot-pound is exerted on it. Yeah. You can go spend all day on Wikipedia trying to understand that statement if you want. Now, really, we're talking about momentum when we talk about that arrow once it gets to the deer. It possesses momentum the whole time, of course, because that's what, it's moving through space. But once that arrow gets to the deer, the momentum becomes very important because it allows us, and again, you can look at these various online calculators, but it allows us to tell one arrow rig versus another how potentially that is going to affect its ability to get a pass-through. And pass-throughs is what we all like as crossbow hunters. It's what we deserve as crossbow hunters. So momentum's very important in accomplishing that. Now, how do you calculate momentum? That is mass times velocity. That one's real simple, right? It's basically weight times speed. You take your overall arrow weight, weigh that out, and multiply that times speed, or you can do it on a calculator, or you can go to your online calculators and calculate that stuff. But basically, that's how you're going to calculate momentum. And again, slugs is just the term that is used to express the amount of momentum that arrow rig has. Now, if we go back to our bowling ball analogy, once the bowling ball reaches its target, it makes contact with the pins. That's where we really want to be able to measure or understand momentum. That is where momentum really shines. That is what makes all those pins affect other pins, and it pushes them out of the way, and those pins jump all over the place and knock all the pins down, hopefully. That bowling ball possesses a lot of momentum. Now, I want to point out here that in both of those calculations, whether we're talking about kinetic energy or we're talking about momentum, in both of those calculations, speed, the speed of your crossbow, is very important. The speed of your arrow is very important. If you look at it in terms of the calculation of kinetic energy, the mass or the weight of that arrow only counts for half, right? We're taking that weight and we're dividing that in half. On the other hand, we're multiplying the speed by itself. So speed plays a much greater role in the calculation of kinetic energy than weight does. So if you want more kinetic energy, you got to increase the speed of your arrow. Increasing the weight of your arrow, that might affect kinetic energy somewhat, but not nearly as much as increasing the speed of the arrow. When we talk about momentum, it's a little bit different. You can increase the weight, or you can increase the speed of your arrow, or you can increase both. But if you increase one of those two factors, the weight or the speed, they're both equally weighted in that equation. They're both of equal value. You increase the weight, you increase momentum. You increase speed, you increase momentum, the same amount. Granted, in order to change the speed, you have to either lighten the arrow, right, which is going to have the adverse effect. It's actually going to reduce your momentum, or you have to get a new crossbow. Now, to go back to our bowling ball analogy, I did some calculations actually, and it's kind of interesting. At 18 miles per hour, that's about 26 feet per second. So bowling balls are not moving very fast. Let's say we take one of the heavy ones, that weighs 16 pounds. That's actually 112,000 grains. Now, grains is just another way of measuring that we're familiar with. If you go to these online calculators, or if you're buying arrows, you can buy arrows of different grain weights. It's a measurement of weight that applies to our arrows or broadheads. 100 grain, 125 grain, 150 grain, very common numbers. When we look at our bowling ball example, at only 26 feet per second, but 112,000 grains, it generates kinetic energy in the amount of 168 foot-pounds, which that's a pretty good number for a modern crossbow. In fact, it's right in the midst of what the modern crossbows would offer. But look at the difference with momentum. It generates 12.93 slugs of momentum. 12.93, almost 13 slugs. I'd say the bowling ball mooses We talk about crossbows and crossbow arrows, heavy arrow rigs, 700 grains, not 112,000 or anything like that, but 750 grain arrows or 900 grain arrows. Understand that those are still generating out of most archery equipment less than one slug. Can you believe that? Less than one. We call them slugs, but in reality, we're usually talking about 0.5, 0.7, 0.8, or maybe even 0.9 slugs. Some guys can stretch modern crossbows shooting 450 feet per second up to a slug or maybe 1.1 slugs, but not 12.93. We are not dealing with bowling ball levels of momentum. Crossbows are not bowling balls. Arrows are not bowling balls. We are dealing with very small numbers here, really, and not moving the needle very much when we add weight. Again, we're not talking about 112,000 grains. We're talking about sometimes whether we're going to shoot 400 grains that came with the crossbow or whether we're going to shoot 500 grains, right? Adding 100 grains to it. Understand that there's 437 and a half grains in an ounce. So if you shoot a 400 grain arrow, you're shooting an arrow that weighs less than an ounce. Even the heavy arrow guys that are shooting arrows that weigh 750 grains, for example, that's basically an ounce and a half, right? That's the kind of numbers we're dealing with, an ounce and 3/4, less than 2 ounces, less than 2 ounces. And it will never generate that amount of momentum that the bowling ball will. Your hunting strategy should not be centered around momentum or kinetic energy or any of these numbers. Once you got your crossbow and your arrow picked out, these numbers help you do that. But once you've picked out your crossbow, you've chosen an arrow, you've chosen a broadhead, these numbers become less important. They're still fun to play around with, I get that. But really now's the time to start focusing on scouting and setting up a tree stand, stuff like that. What's going to make you a better hunter? And it's not these numbers. So I hope this helps you understand these different terms that we keep throwing around here and how they impact your crossbow hunting. Impact. That's a pretty good pun. But anyway, I hope we have a lot of momentum going forward on future videos. Okay, okay, that one was intentional. I'm sorry. But I do hope that this helps you sort of understand one arrow setup versus another. I hope it helps you understand one crossbow versus another. And in the end, I hope that you will join us next time here on Death by Bungie. Until next time, all hail Bungie.